December 20, 1943. 27,000 feet above the North Sea. The temperature was 40 degrees below zero. A single B-17 bomber struggled through the thin air, trailing smoke from two dead engines. The plexiglass nose was shattered. The tail gunner was dead in his position. The waist gunner lay unconscious, his blood freezing against the fuselage wall. The pilot, 21-year-old Charlie Brown, could barely see through the cracked windscreen. His co-pilot was slumped forward, wounded. The oxygen system had failed. Most of the crew was passing in and out of consciousness. Behind them, the city of Bremen still burned. This was the Luftwaffe's territory. German fighter bases lined the coast. Radar stations tracked every Allied movement. The sky belonged to them. And somewhere in that cold December air, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 was climbing to intercept. The German pilot's name was Franz Stigler. He was an ace with 27 confirmed kills. One more would earn him the Knight's Cross, Nazi Germany's highest military honor. One more kill and his name would be recorded in the fighter pilot rolls of honor. One more American bomber and he would join the elite. He had been waiting for this moment his entire combat career. What happened next would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. To understand this moment, you need to understand what the air war over Europe had become by December 1943. The strategic bombing campaign had reached its peak of brutality. The 8th Air Force was flying missions deep into Germany daily, losing bombers at rates that couldn't be sustained. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything they had at the formations. No mercy was expected. None was given. The rules were simple. You destroyed the enemy. You shot down bombers before they could reach their targets. You killed the crews that killed German civilians. You protected the fatherland. Every fighter pilot knew these rules. Every one of them had lost friends to the bombers. Franz Stigler had lost his brother to a British raid on Hamburg. His unit, Jägerschwader 27, had been stationed at Oldenburg Airfield since November. They'd been flying multiple missions daily, intercepting the American bomber streams that came in relentless waves. The pilots were exhausted. The aircraft were worn out. The mechanics worked around the clock just to keep enough fighters operational for the next mission. But they kept flying. On the morning of December 20th, Stigler had already flown 2 combat missions. He'd engaged American fighters over the Dutch coast. He'd fired all his ammunition. He'd landed at Oldenburg to rearm and refuel. The ground crew was working frantically when the alert came. Another formation was returning from Bremen. Stragglers were breaking off from the main group. Damaged bombers, easy kills. Stigler's Messerschmitt was ready before he was. The engine was still warm. The ammunition belts were loaded. The oxygen bottles were full. His mechanic gave him the thumbs up. Stigler climbed into the cockpit, pulled on his gloves and took off alone. He climbed toward the sound of distant engines. The standing order was clear: destroy all bombers. No exceptions. Damaged aircraft were priority targets. Crews that had dropped their bombs and were trying to escape were to be shot down without hesitation. The Luftwaffe had learned through bitter experience that letting bombers return meant they would come back. Better to kill them now. Stigler had been following these orders for years. He'd shot down bombers over Tunisia, over Sicily, over Italy. He'd seen his friends die. He'd watched his brother's city burn. He knew what the bombers did to German cities. He knew what was at stake. As he climbed through 20,000 feet, he spotted the B-17. It was alone. Separated from its formation. Flying too slowly, too low. One engine was completely gone, torn from its mounting. Another was dead, propeller feathered. The tail section was riddled with holes. The entire aircraft looked like it had been through a shredder. It was the perfect kill. Stigler pushed the throttle forward and closed the distance. He came up from behind and below the classic attack position. His gun sight was on. His finger was on the trigger. This would take 1 burst. Maybe 2. The bomber couldn't defend itself. The tail gun wasn't moving. No return fire came. Then he got close enough to see inside. Through the shattered waist windows he could see the gunner lying on the floor. Not moving. Blood everywhere. The tail gunner was slumped in his position, clearly dead. The bomber's entire tail section was shot to pieces. How it was still flying was impossible to understand. Stigler pulled alongside the bomber's left wing. He was close enough to see the pilot clearly. A young man, baby-faced, struggling with the controls. Blood on his face. The co-pilot was wounded. Stigler could see other crew members moving weakly inside the aircraft. These weren't warriors. They were boys. Dying boys. And they couldn't fight back. In that moment something shifted. Stigler thought of his first instructor, an old pilot from the First World War named Gustav Rodel. On Stigler's first day of flight training, Rodel had pulled him aside after a lecture on combat tactics. He'd looked Stigler in the eye and said something that never left him. "If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." It was about honor. About the rules that separated warriors from murderers. About the line that couldn't be crossed, even in total war. You could kill an enemy in combat. You could shoot down his aircraft. But once he was helpless, once he couldn't fight back, the rules changed. Shooting this bomber would be murder. The B-17 crew saw the Messerschmitt pull alongside. Charlie Brown, the pilot, couldn't believe what he was seeing. A German fighter, close enough to touch, flying formation with them. Not firing. Just flying there. The German pilot made eye contact. He gestured. Get out of here. Head for England. Brown didn't understand at first. Was this a trick? Was the fighter guiding them toward more interceptors? But the German kept pointing west. Toward the coast. Toward safety. Stigler flew alongside the crippled bomber for several minutes. He positioned his fighter between the B-17 and the German coastline, knowing that flak batteries below wouldn't fire while he was there. They'd assume he was escorting a captured aircraft. It was insane. It violated every rule. It could get him court-martialed. Shot. But he couldn't shoot them down. When they reached the coast, Stigler came so close that Brown could see his face clearly through the canopy. The German pilot saluted. Then he peeled away and disappeared into the clouds, heading back toward Germany. The B-17 limped across the North Sea. One engine quit completely over the water. Another was losing power. Charlie Brown flew by instinct alone, barely conscious from oxygen deprivation and blood loss. The crew had no idea where they were. The navigator was wounded. The instruments were destroyed. But they made it. They crash-landed at Seething, an RAF base on the English coast. The aircraft broke apart on impact. Somehow, everyone who was still alive when the bomber left German airspace survived the landing. When the ground crew reached the wreckage, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The B-17 had over 200 holes in it. The tail section was barely attached. 3 engines were destroyed. The fuselage was shredded. It should not have been capable of flight. And the crew told a story that no one believed. A German fighter pilot had escorted them to safety. Had protected them from flak. Had let them escape. The intelligence officers didn't buy it. It made no sense. Why would a Luftwaffe pilot do that? It had to be confusion, oxygen deprivation, shock. The crew must have been mistaken. Charlie Brown was ordered never to speak about it. The incident was classified. If word got out that German pilots were showing mercy, it might affect morale. Bomber crews needed to believe the enemy was ruthless. That every German pilot would kill them given the chance. That mercy didn't exist at 27,000 feet. So the story died. Classified. Forgotten. Franz Stigler landed back at Oldenburg. He never reported the encounter. Never told his commanding officer. Never filed a claim for the kill. He simply landed, shut down his engine and walked away from his aircraft. If anyone had known what he'd done, he would have faced a firing squad. Letting an enemy bomber escape was treason. Protecting it from flak was aiding the enemy. In the winter of 1943, with Germany fighting for survival, such mercy could not be tolerated. So Stigler remained silent. He flew for the rest of the war. He survived. He never earned his Knight's Cross. That 28th kill never came. After the war, he emigrated to Canada, started a new life, and never spoke about what happened over the North Sea on December 20, 1943. Charlie Brown went on to fly more missions. He completed his tour. He survived the war. But he never forgot the German pilot who saved his life. The memory stayed with him through the decades that followed. That moment of eye contact. That salute. That impossible mercy. In 1986, more than 40 years after the war, Charlie Brown decided to find the German pilot. He was retired by then, living in Florida. He started writing letters to Luftwaffe veteran associations. He contacted military historians. He described the encounter in detail. The date, the location, the aircraft type, everything he could remember. Most recipients thought he was crazy. Some didn't respond at all. But Brown kept searching. He needed to know who had saved his crew. He needed to understand why. In 1990, a letter arrived at Brown's home in Florida. It was from Vancouver, Canada. From a man named Franz Stigler. I was the pilot of the Messerschmitt. The two men met in Seattle. They were both in their 70s by then. They had lived entire lives since that December day in 1943. They had families, careers, decades of memories. But when they saw each other, they both wept. Stigler explained what had happened. Why he couldn't shoot. How his instructor's words had echoed in his mind. How he saw not an enemy bomber but a crew of wounded boys who couldn't defend themselves. How shooting them would have crossed a line he couldn't uncross. I didn't shoot because I didn't want to, Stigler said simply. It would have been murder. They became friends. Best friends. They traveled together, spoke at events together, told their story together. They were brothers in a way that transcended nationality or uniform. They had shared something profound in that frozen sky over the North Sea. A moment of humanity that neither could forget. Franz Stigler died in 2008. Charlie Brown died in 2008, just months later. They were buried continents apart, but their story remained. The story of the day mercy won. The historical record shows that such moments were rare. The air war over Europe was brutal beyond comprehension. Bomber crews had a life expectancy measured in missions, not months. Fighter pilots died by the thousands. The losses on both sides were staggering. Mercy was a luxury that few could afford. But it happened. Documented cases exist of German pilots escorting damaged Allied bombers away from combat zones. Of American pilots holding fire when they saw enemy pilots bailing out. Of moments when warriors chose humanity over orders. These moments didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't stop the bombing. They didn't end the killing. But they proved something important. That even in the worst circumstances, in the most brutal conflict in human history, the capacity for mercy still existed. The choice was always there. Franz Stigler made his choice at 27,000 feet, with his finger on the trigger, knowing what it could cost him. He chose mercy. He chose honor. He chose to see the enemy as human. Charlie Brown made his choice when he landed in England. He could have exaggerated the encounter, claimed they fought off the German fighter, turned a moment of mercy into a story of combat heroism. Instead, he told the truth even though no one believed him. Both men paid a price for those choices. Stigler never got his Knight's Cross. Brown carried the memory as a burden for 40 years. But they also gained something that few combat veterans ever find. They found peace. Not with the war but with themselves. The bombing campaign continued after December 20, 1943. The 8th Air Force flew more missions. The Luftwaffe kept intercepting. The cities kept burning. The crews kept dying. The war ground on with its own terrible logic. But on that one day, over that one cold stretch of sea, two men chose differently. They chose mercy. And decades later, when they finally met, when they finally understood what they'd given each other, they both realized the same truth. Mercy isn't weakness. It's the hardest choice a warrior can make. It takes more courage to hold fire than to pull the trigger. More strength to show compassion than to show ruthlessness. The war demanded ruthlessness. But humanity demanded something else. In the years after they met, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler spoke at schools, at veteran gatherings, at peace conferences. They told their story not to glorify war but to show what can survive it. They wanted people to understand that even in the darkest moments, even when everything in your training and your orders and your survival instinct tells you to kill, you still have a choice. You can always choose mercy. Their story became a book, then articles, then documentaries. It reached millions of people. And almost everyone who heard it asked the same question. Would I have made that choice? If I'd been in Stigler's cockpit with my finger on the trigger, would I have held fire? We want to believe we would. We want to believe we'd see the humanity in the enemy. That we'd choose honor over orders. But we can't know. None of us can know until we're in that moment. Franz Stigler knew. He lived it. And he made the choice that defined the rest of his life. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 he flew that day no longer exists. Shot down later in the war or scrapped or lost to history. The B-17 that Charlie Brown flew was destroyed on landing. The physical evidence of that encounter is gone. But the choice remains. Preserved in the memories of the crew who survived. In the letters Franz Stigler wrote. In the friendship that lasted until both men died months apart in 2008. Their choice echoes still. In military academies where the story is taught. In ethics classes where students debate what honor means. In the minds of anyone who has ever faced an impossible decision and wondered what the right thing to do might be. The air war over Europe killed hundreds of thousands of men. It destroyed cities. It broke families. It left scars that never healed. We remember it for the destruction, the sacrifice, the terrible price of victory. But we should also remember it for the moments when mercy survived. When warriors chose to be human. When the rules of war were broken not out of weakness but out of strength. December 20, 1943. 27,000 feet above the North Sea. 40 degrees below zero. Two men chose mercy. And changed everything.